Hey there, it's the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. So much to cover, so little time. The world is our oyster. Speaking of diving for pearls, Stacy?
I got my sunglasses on again, once again. We're still in North Carolina. You know, some of the carrier deal jobs were saved here in Charlotte, North Carolina, about 100 executive jobs. Donald Trump saved something like 800 jobs. 1,300 still went to Mexico from the carrier plant in Indiana. This is what is going to be the topic of the show because it's about the messaging, what Donald Trump is doing in terms of messaging.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, the jury is still out on the Trump phenomenon in terms of what this all means politically for America. There's a lot of speculation. He's moving fast. I think Obama has had to ask him on a couple of occasions, please wait until you're sworn in before you start enacting policy.
Well, I'm going to look at a piece from Business Insider, and it's Josh Barro wrote this, and it's regarding Trump's carrier deal, and it's talking about the messaging, because messaging is important. Donald Trump has radically changed the messaging of GOP policy, GOP orthodoxy for the past 30, 40 years, certainly since Ronald Reagan, and that is the carrier deal shows what Trump understands about the politics of jobs. Because remember, jobs are supposed to no longer matter anymore. Because the left wing or liberals or Democrats, whatever you want to call them, will say, well, you know, sure that, you know, the manufacturer might move to Mexico, but global wealth rises with that. Sorry if you're hearing, you know, our sound man is quite nervous because there's a plane overhead. You probably don't hear it, but there is a plane overhead. Don't be scared.
It's Trump!
The carrier deal shows that President-elect Donald Trump's deal to keep 800 carrier workers in Indiana is not a broad-spectrum jobs policy, though if the $7 million 10-year price tag reported by the Wall Street Journal summarizes the deal's full fiscal cost, it looks as if it may have been a pretty good value at just $875 per year per job not moved to Mexico. This is the important thing because under neoliberalism, which the Democrats have embraced wholeheartedly, they say that jobs disappearing doesn't matter, that it's the overall trade deal and the overall GDP growth, the GDP growth that concentrates into the hands of the 95% of the GDP growth has concentrated into the hands of the 1% on the coastal areas.
Right. Remember, under Reagan, of course, it was trickle-down economics, and you make the rich people able to make more money, it's going to trickle down. And after this whole neoliberal experiment, the voters said, guess what? Didn't work. Nothing trickled down to our satisfaction. We're going to bring in Trump. Trump is going after the trickle-up theory, and that we've got jobs on the ground that are going to be high-paying jobs, middle-class jobs, and this will lead to 8 years of Trump. I mean, he knows where his bread is buttered. He's not going to... Remember when Obama took office, he immediately abandoned the social media, the generation that put him into office. He just moved on and said, I've used you and I don't care about you anymore. Now, Trump, I think, is saying, look, jobs, white guys getting jobs in Wisconsin put me in the office. I'm not going to abandon them. As a matter of fact, I'm going to build on that. And why wouldn't he if he wants to do 8 years instead of 4 years?
So I'm going to continue walking a little bit here. And what I want to say is that Josh Barro here looks at how much of a break from normal economic messaging this has been by Trump, how he has broke from George W. Bush and then the whole GO party since then. So he says that consider the two phases of pre-Trump Republican economic messaging during the century. President George W. Bush promoted an ownership society in which ordinary people got to enjoy the rising fortunes of capital through their ownership of assets. Well, it turns out that only the wealthy own the assets. So when prices rose, when the prices of stocks and shares and bonds and houses rose, it was the wealthy. And the only way the middle class was able to participate in this was through leverage. And that, as he points out, was a disaster. Following on the economic collapse of 2007, 2008, what the Republicans then decided to do was say, remember what Mitt Romney had said, well, the thing is, it's the 47%. They're takers. Those people are just takers and whingers, and they don't have, they fail to participate in the ownership society, and they're just takers, and they're lazy. But Trump gets, as Josh Barro points out, that people, according to his economic messaging, it focuses on one correct core idea. What most people want is to be able to comfortably support themselves and their families with the income from a job, not from speculating in shares. They just want a job.
Well, that's an interesting question. Will people, if given a chance to get a high-paying job at a factory, will they like that? If it means paying more for stuff at Walmart. And what I mean by this is that, yeah, everyone's been disenfranchised over the past 20 years, but the prices of stuff at Walmart has gone down faster than wages. So on a net basis, lifestyle has been maintained and in many cases improved. Folks who are not making a lot of money still are able to buy big screen TVs, Asian-made, slave-made clothes, genetically modified food that's cheaper. So their lifestyles actually didn't take a huge hit. So here you have Trump coming in and saying, no, we're going to give you jobs. But by the way, that means that stuff at Walmart's going to go up in price. So the net effect of this could be that people's actual lifestyle with the higher paying job may decrease.
Well, all I'm saying is that could be the long-term policy, but right now, people do not care. They want a job. They want some dignity. They want to go to work in the morning. They want to wake up for the alarm at 7 a.m., get to the manufacturing plant at 8 a.m., go out with their buddies after work, have a beer perhaps, and they just want to they want to have a job and create wealth. So here he's also saying that the fact, a lot of Democrats and a lot of journalists say that Trump had no policy, that he was never pushed any policy. But Josh Barro points out that, in fact, if you listen to any of his speeches, if you listen to what he actually said, he did have policy. And here's just a few of the ideas that he had pushed as policy. Immigration restrictions that would protect American workers from competition for jobs with foreigners. Trade restrictions that would make it more favorable for companies to locate production in the U.S. than to import goods from abroad. Bank deregulation to encourage more lending. Lower taxes on business income to encourage investment, fewer restrictions on domestic energy production, increased military spending, new government benefits for child care and maternity leave, blah, 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 blah. But most importantly, he says that he broke completely free with both Republicans and Democrats, and that Donald Trump pointed out, he said in a speech and in his policies since on his tweets, he's been talking about a 35% tax on a retributive tax on any company that leaves America and goes to Mexico, abandoning the U.S. and trying to send manufacturing overseas and then shipping their goods back in, they would get a 35% tariff. But what he broke with was saying that he believes we have stakeholder capitalism, not just shareholder capitalism, that the company owners make the choice to send these jobs overseas. For example, with the Carrier manufacturing plant, we covered this at the time, over a year ago when they announced that they were going to go to Mexico. And what it is that they were very profitable with their workers in Indiana, but they wanted even more profitability by going to Mexico.
Right, there is a model for this that exists already. It's called Germany.
Yes.
This is the German model, stakeholder capitalism. People have high wages. They have their social benefits programs in surplus. And as we've reported on this show recently, the funny thing there is that those great German companies that have already got this kind of system in place are being bought out by Chinese companies. So that's kind of an interesting twist too. So America is becoming more like Germany. Germany is being bought up by China. And Japan is still the place to go to get super cheap money.
So, Josh Barro then points out that this is, again, I want to talk about the economic messaging. It's a very important thing. It's so crucial. It's so crucial to understand what's going on with Trump because you have grown up completely. I have only known shareholder capitalism, shareholder democracy. That's the only thing I've ever known my entire life. Maybe when I was little, there was a different sort of system, but since Reagan, all I know is shareholder democracy and that shareholders get whatever they want. Shareholders can, maximize profits. They can wipe away jobs, that we don't need a plan. We don't need a policy. We don't need industrial policy. We don't need to plan for the future. We don't need jobs. We could do some magic sort of contractual financialization and we could all be wealthy, but that didn't turn out to be true. And as he points out, a lot of people just want a job. They just want a job. They don't want to be entrepreneurs. They don't want to be paper pushers. They don't want to, figure a way to collateralize, every single piece of sand or flight that flies over us.
Yeah, well, I mean, the time to reform shareholder-based capitalism was 2008, when it failed. And you had the global financial crisis due to an over-reliance on shareholder capitalism versus a more balanced stakeholder capitalism. But the response in 2008 was to simply write a check to the global banking system of approximately $20 trillion to make sure that those shareholders are made whole, even though it meant disenfranchising a whole generation, which have now in turn elected Trump. So now Trump will read the tea leaves, he'll see what's going on, and they'll say, you know what, maybe the stakeholder capitalism, the time is now. The pressure obviously will be enormous. The stock market is the arbiter in this case of who wins and who loses. We've got a rally in the stock market, new all-time highs. Obviously, if that continues, then Trump is probably the greatest financial genius that has ever walked the face of the earth. But if the stock market were to correct and people started losing in their 401k plans and retirement accounts, then there will be a very serious discussion. Remember, under Clinton administration, the healthcare industry, in order to coerce Bill Clinton to abandon this idea of healthcare for all, they went and staged a hissy fit in the bond market. The bond market crashed, and Bill Clinton famously said that when he dies, he wants to come back as the bond market because the bond market's got all the power. Well, the bond market's down. Are the bond vigilantes back in place? Are bond prices going to crash? Are interest rates going to rise? Will Trump be able to deal with that? That's the question.
And finally, I want to say here that, he points out that the Democrats have done a lot for the poor. Obviously, the Republicans have done nothing for the poor. They've done a lot for the wealthy. But the Democrats were always afraid to go change policy, to be non-neoliberal. They've done a lot for the poor. They have expanded Medicaid under Obamacare, but they point out in this article that it's the middle class that has paid for it because nobody wants to touch the owners of Carrier Corporation. They have targeted those on the $50,000 to $100,000 income, as you mentioned, with Michael Carmichael yesterday.
Well, he's treading a fine line, and it's fascinating to see how this reinvention of America goes. So much more reinvention, but real news coming your way after the break. Don't go away.
I'm Tom Harpin, and I'll give you what the mainstream media can't, the big picture.
There's been no charges filed in that
And when you question more, you find what you're looking for.
This is the legislative branch of the parliament.
We'll go deeper, investigate, and debate, all so you can get the big picture.
चार दीवारी में वो पैदा होती है और चार दीवारी में ही वो मर जाती है यहाँ पे। जब लड़कियाँ औरतें यहाँ घरों के अंदर चार दीवारी में मार खा सकती हैं आदमियों के हाथ की, तो क्यों वो बॉक्सिंग नहीं कर सकती?
मैं रिंग पर होती तो बिल्कुल मैं चेंज ही हो जाती हूँ कि मैं जैसा कि मुझे खुशी से होती है।
मैंने लोगों की परवाह करना छोड़ दिया है, तभी मैं आज बॉक्सिंग भी कर रही हूँ, आज स्टडी भी कर रही हूँ।
मैं किसी चीज़ से नहीं डरती हूँ, मैं बॉक्सिंग इसलिए करती हूँ क्योंकि कोई मुझे छेड़े तो मैं उसको मारूँ।
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser, still with Michael Carmichael of PlanetaryMovement.org. He's a political junkie. He started his political career as a strategist for Robert Kennedy and continued advising the Democratic candidates all the way up to Bernie Sanders in 2016. Michael, when we left off our conversation, we were talking about Trump's first day or two in office. Your thought is that he will immediately attack Obamacare. Tell us more. What your thoughts are.
I think you're going to see, instead of a fantastic 100 days as is usual for the American presidency, you're going to see a fantastically active 100 hours with Trump.
Wow.
That he is going to he will launch many different initiatives in that first period of time. And among them will be his attack on the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare.
I think I see where you're going with that, and I've thought about this myself. In other words, what he's doing now is he's preparing an enormous 100-hour assault of stuff.
Exactly.
And he's filling his cabinet with hard men, hard guys. There's no softy in there. They're just hard across the board, and I think they're going to try to ram through an enormous amount of stuff in the first week or two. If your thoughts?
I totally agree with that. It's going to be shock and awe in the political spectrum.
Right, and I think that this is, on one hand, people are going to be welcoming of this because the system is dysfunctional. But on the other hand, it's an enormous risk because on the other end of that shock and awe of political activity could be a much different country than what we started with.
You know, we really have to face it, Max. This is a tremendous break with American tradition. The Trump administration is going to set new records. I mean, I expect him to be even more historical than George W. Bush. And the paradigm that was established under Bush is going to look very attractive compared to the
George
paradigm.
W. Bush, in the wake of 9/11, passed a lot of new legislation that gave the government enhanced spying powers and undermined the Bill of Rights in many ways. And is that what you mean in terms of a transformative government?
Yes, absolutely. The Patriot Act.
The Patriot Act, exactly.
The Patriot Act, for example. And then that, of course, led us into this quagmire in the Middle East. The war, I just read this morning in a report by John Pilger that the United States has spent $5 trillion on military and defense expenditures since 9/11. So it's going to have a huge economic component.
Now, the irony of it, of course, is that some of the Trump policies and actions, of course, you would think would please the left and the liberals and the progressives. You know, the activity over there at the Carrier plant in Indianapolis, where he saved jobs. He's talking about other initiatives that are really out of the progressive playbook. This idea, well, protecting jobs for one thing. I mean, so how do the progressives deal with this? Because in other words, he's saying stuff that my colleague Ed Schultz, for example, on RT,
yes.
RT America, leading up to the election, pointed this out many times, that progressives need to listen to what Trump's saying because he's saying things that are of the progressive playbook.
He is stealing things right out of the progressive playbook. He is copying Bernie Sanders and Dennis Kucinich and other leading progressives, including Elizabeth Warren. So he's been very strategic in doing that. Let's see if he follows through. Let's see if he follows through. Yes, it's wonderful that we're finally taking action at the federal level to preserve some American jobs for Carrier. Let's see if that's going to become a broadening policy. Let's hope it doesn't just evolve into protective tariffs.
Well, yeah, I mean, let's talk about what he's talking about in terms of American companies. If they relocate outside of the U.S., they're going to be subject to basically an exit tariff. Corporations claim to be individuals now. They claim to have all the rights of individuals. I know if an individual of means wants to expatriate from the U.S. and turn back their U.S. passport, they're charged with an exit fee, an exit tax. So I would think that why can't corporations, if they want to be individuals, if they want all the rights of individuals, then they should be subject to the same taxation as individuals.
Well, yes, of course they should be. Of course they should be. I mean, there should be, look, you spent a lot of time in Europe, and I think from that experience you're well aware that the major corporations have far, far more regulations. They're in a much tighter regulatory framework than in the United States, particularly banks, particularly insurance companies, and particularly in the financial community. Not to mention, the labor...
You're saying Europe is more or less?
Far more regulation than the United States. This is the land of laissez-faire capitalism.
That's your perception?
Yes, that's my perception.
Well, my experience tells me that that's not true. And that, in fact, not to hijack this interview, but American banks outsource their fraud to banks in the UK, for example. In other words, when a bank wants to what's called infinitely rehypothecate, that is to say, use the same security and lend it out an infinite number of times, you can only do that in the UK. So that's why all the scandals, the Bernie Madoff, the JP Morgan London whale, the Lehman collapse, all these things really went through London and through Europe because the regulation is almost non-existent.
It's non-existent, not only in London, in lots of other places too.
Sure, but the U.S. has...
The U.S. has some enforcement. We've got...
Yes, I would agree with you that...
There's enforcement over here.
Or George W. Bush made enforcement against Enron, and Jeff Skilling went to jail.
Well, indeed.
Whereas Bill Clinton repealed Glass-Steagall.
Exactly.
Commodity Futures Modernization Act made trading in derivatives, made it from gambling to being perfectly legal. So Clinton was the Wall Street's best friend. So is Donald Trump... Here's my question. Is Donald Trump going to be more like Teddy Roosevelt, a trust buster, a reformer, a guy who will be perceived as a sellout to his class, to betray his class? Or is he going to be everyone's worst nightmare, the Goldman Sachs apparatchik that takes that $20 trillion in debt that the U.S. has and pays it off by selling America to the highest bidder?
What a good question, and I do not have the answer to it.
Good question,
But of course, it's a very good question, and of course, I would like to see him become a Teddy Roosevelt.
Who was a progressive, but also he invented progressivism.
He did, and of course, it's FDR who actually succeeded in legislating most of it.
Right, so you had the robber barons of the previous century.
That's right.
The Carnegies and the Mellons and these folks.
All the rest.
And they aggregated enormous wealth, and Teddy Roosevelt betrayed his class. So why can't Trump, at this point, we don't know.
We don't know. The jury is out on that. And I wonder whether we're going to see any action in the first 100 hours of the Trump presidency. So we'll learn a lot more within the next few weeks.
How about the popular culture and how they're handling Donald Trump? You know, what's fascinating is Donald Trump is the first Twitter president. I think that's safe to say.
Yes.
He has used the medium, obviously brilliantly, because he's the president of the United States, and all of the faux pas that people were crying out, oh, you can't do that on the public Twitter page, you don't seem presidential. Well, now he's the president-elect. And you have this raging war on established cultural outlets like Saturday Night Live. You know, they have the representation of Donald Trump almost on every week now. Alec Baldwin, whose portrayal, who actually recently they had, the Twitter war became the centerpiece of really this satire of the president. You've been around for a while. I've been around a while. You know, I think back to the 1960s where you had very active political satire when Nixon was in office.
Oh, yeah.
And it was very effective. And, you know, Nixon was eventually impeached because you had an enormous outcry from the public. You had the Kent State murder. You had the Vietnam War raging. Is the country at a point now where culture and art and satire could once again emerge as a potent political force? Because for the last 20 or 30 years, let's say since Reagan, since Top Gun, the movie, celebrating patriotism, we've had very, very little or very weak political satire in America. Will the pendulum swing back?
Definitely. It definitely
Tell me
will.
about it.
Well, it's going to be on social media, too. We have social media now, and it's already swinging back. Your program, for example, is one way in which the social media is swinging back at American politics.
What about this idea that RT is a propaganda outlet, and the Washington Post quoted virtually an anonymous website who made a list of 200 people that they consider to be dangerously in the pocket of foreign interests? And, of course, Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi and respected journalists have come out and said this is hogwash. But isn't this just McCarthyism repackaged?
It is just McCarthyism repackaged. There's no question about that. And it's also an attack on the First Amendment. And it may be a prelude to some more draconian laws that we've been talking about already today.
Beyond the Patriot Act?
Well, it could be. We don't know.
Isn't it ironic that Russia, previously the Soviet Union, and America are like two ships passing in the night? America is moving toward a Soviet Union type political and media system, and Russia, meanwhile, is just cutting deals, doing deals, and trying to move away from their past as communists.
Well, yes, it's tragic that in our lifetimes, America has fallen from a very high ranking on the freedom of press, annual freedom of press listing. We're now down to about 51st on the on the International Press Freedom Index. So, and I mean, it's terrible what I've seen happen in the United States. We've lost the fairness doctrine. We've pretty much lost the equal time requirement. Not only that, we've lost the tradition of.
Let me talk about the fairness doctrine for a second, because this is an interesting topic for me, because there used to be a time when, like in the UK, if you had a political argument, you needed to show both sides of the political argument, and you had a discussion. Then they got rid of it under Reagan, and it gave rise to the shock jock, like the Rush Limbaughs,
yes,
and the hard right wing, the Michael Savages of the world, almost unchecked, unhinged, right wing zealots.
True.
But there's never been a hard left. There's never been a shock left. I mean, I've said I could be a great, if I were a shock left DJ in America, I would push Rush Limbaugh aside. But no distributor would ever give me an outlet. That's why I do international media, because America doesn't want the shock left. They seem very comfortable with having fascists on their media, like a Savage or a Rush Limbaugh. They're very comfortable with, why wouldn't America just fall into proto-fascism? They love fascism. Obviously, their media represents fascism. Why isn't it just going to become essentially fascist?
Why isn't it going to become?
Yeah, more fascist, really hardline fascism.
Don't ask me. I mean, I'm equally concerned about that as you are. And I think we've never been closer to it. I think we are, in fact, diving into a period when the president may be transformed into nothing more than a warlord.
Right.
Because, I mean, the cabinet that Donald Trump is assembling indicates that he is preparing for war. He's preparing for a much more aggressive military agenda than he ever mentioned
Under
during
the fascism of Germany in the 1930s, a lot of people left. And they moved to America. So now, let's say if you're genuinely concerned about this, and you think about leaving, where would you go?
Where would I go? Well, I would go back to England, where I spent 22 years.
But they just passed the most draconian snooping law in the history of democracy. Talk about American snooping law. This is Theresa May's new Snoopers Charter, as they call it, gives the government, essentially, they become your proctologist. They live in your anus, and they examine every morsel of food, every thought you've ever had. They become essentially anus-dwelling, mushroom-swilling, Marmite-worshipping trolls. Essentially, that's where you want to go?
You know what?
Are you mad?
You know what? No, listen. I don't have any.
We got to wrap it up. We got to cut it off there. Give that some thought.
Okay.
For our next conversation.
Will do.
All right. That's going to do it for this episode of the Keiser Report. It's me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. Michael Carmichael. If you want to reach us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.